At the end of World War II, Korea should have been free. Instead, it became the first battlefield of the Cold War, divided not by its own people, but by two exhausted American officers drawing a line across a map late at night. Within 5 years, that line would erupt into one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century, a war that technically has never ended. To understand how the Korean War began, we have to go back decades before the first shot was fired, to a Korea that no longer existed as an independent nation. In 1910, Korea was formally annexed by Imperial Japan. For the next 35 years, the Korean people lived under harsh colonial rule. Japanese authorities suppressed Korean language, culture, and identity. Korean land was seized, food was requisitioned, and thousands were forced into labor. By the time World War II ended, Korea was politically fractured, economically drained, and deeply scarred by occupation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, it did so suddenly. The collapse of the Japanese Empire created an immediate power vacuum across East Asia. In Korea, there was no transition plan, no provisional government recognized by the major powers, and no unified military to maintain order. What followed was one of the most rushed and consequential decisions of the 20th century. With Soviet forces advancing from the north and American forces still far away, U.S. officials needed a quick solution to manage Japan's surrender in Korea. Two American officers were tasked with drawing a temporary dividing line. They chose the 38th parallel not because of history, culture, or geography, but because it roughly split the peninsula in half and kept the capital city of Seoul in the southern zone. The Soviets accepted the proposal. What was meant to be temporary would soon harden into a permanent division. North of the 38th parallel, Soviet forces moved in and began shaping a communist state. They supported a young guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung, who had fought against the Japanese alongside communist forces. With Soviet backing, Kim consolidated power, eliminated rivals, and built a centralized, authoritarian government aligned with Moscow. South of the 38th parallel, the United States faced a very different problem. American forces arrived with little understanding of Korean politics and no clear long-term plan. They supported anti-communist leaders, eventually backing Syngman Rhee, a fiercely nationalist figure who had spent years in exile. Rhee was deeply opposed to communism and just as determined to reunify Korea under his rule. By 1948, Korea was no longer one country in practice. Two governments were formally established, each claiming to be the sole legitimate authority over the entire peninsula. Both believed reunification was inevitable. Both believed force might be necessary to achieve it. Tensions along the 38th parallel escalated quickly. Border clashes became frequent. Skirmishes turned deadly. Each side tested the other's resolve. Civilians living near the border were caught in the middle, facing raids, reprisals, and political purges. What is often forgotten is that the Korean War did not begin suddenly in 1950. Violence was already happening, and the peninsula was already unstable. International politics made the situation even more dangerous. The Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union and the United States no longer viewed regional conflicts as local matters. Every crisis was seen through the lens of global ideology. When communist forces won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, creating the People's Republic of China, the balance of power in Asia shifted dramatically. Communist influence now surrounded Korea from the north and west. Kim Il-sung saw opportunity. He believed the South was weak, politically divided, and militarily unprepared. He believed the United States would not intervene decisively. He sought approval from both Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. After months of negotiation and calculation, support was granted. South Korea, meanwhile, was not ready for war. Its military lacked heavy weapons, armor, and air support. American forces had largely withdrawn, believing the peninsula was not a primary strategic priority. Warnings were missed, signals were misread. Both sides believed time was on their side. Then, before dawn on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in force. Tanks rolled south. Artillery thundered across the border. Cities fell in rapid succession. What began as a divided occupation zone instantly became a full-scale war. By the end of the first day, it was clear that this would not be a short conflict or a limited police action. Korea was no longer just a former colony struggling for unity. It had become the place where the Cold War turned hot, and the worst was yet to come. When the invasion began on June 25, 1950, it was not a probing attack or a border skirmish. It was a full-scale assault designed to end the war before it truly began. North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel in multiple columns, supported by Soviet-supplied tanks, artillery, and aircraft. South Korean defenders were caught almost completely off guard. Many units had little more than rifles, They had no tanks capable of stopping armored advances, no effective anti-tank weapons, and almost no air power. Within hours, defensive lines collapsed. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell in just 3 days. The speed of the advance shocked observers around the world. Refugees flooded south along every road, clogging supply routes and spreading panic. Bridges were destroyed in desperate attempts to slow the enemy, sometimes with civilians still crossing. Entire police units and government offices disintegrated under pressure. The South Korean government fled south, narrowly escaping capture. The invasion forced an immediate decision in Washington. The United States now faced a test of credibility. If South Korea fell, it would signal to the world that American security guarantees meant little. Within days, U.S. air and naval forces were committed. Soon after, American ground troops were rushed in, many straight from occupation duty in Japan. These early American units were not prepared for what they faced. They were understrength, poorly equipped, and unfamiliar with the terrain. The first major clash, known as Task Force Smith, ended in disaster. U.S. soldiers attempted to stop advancing North Korean tanks with outdated weapons that simply did not work. Tanks rolled through their positions, casualties mounted. The message was clear: this was not going to be an easy fight. Throughout July and August of 1950, North Korean forces continued to push south relentlessly. Town after town fell, defensive lines were drawn, broken, and redrawn. Each retreat cost lives, equipment, and morale. The South Korean army suffered enormous losses, but it did not collapse completely. Instead, it fell back toward a final defensive position in the far southeast of the peninsula. By late summer, United Nations forces, now including troops from multiple allied nations, were compressed into a small area around the port city of Busan. This became known as the Busan Perimeter. If this line broke, there would be nowhere left to retreat. The war would be over. The fighting around the Busan Perimeter was brutal and desperate. North Korean forces attacked again and again, probing for weaknesses, launching night assaults, and exploiting any gap they could find. UN forces fought from hills, riverbanks, and hastily dug trenches. Air power became critical. American aircraft struck supply lines, bridges, and troop concentrations, slowing the advance just enough to keep the perimeter intact. Logistics became a race against time. Busan itself was the lifeline. Through its port flowed troops, ammunition, tanks, and food. Ships arrived constantly, unloading supplies as fast as they could be moved to the front. For the first time since the invasion began, the momentum slowed. The human cost was staggering. Civilians were trapped between advancing armies. Some were accused of collaborating with the enemy and executed without trial. Others fled with nothing but what they could carry. Entire villages were destroyed. The war was already leaving scars that would last for generations. By early September 1950, the situation remained critical but stable. The North Korean advance had been stopped, but just barely. UN forces were exhausted. Casualties were high. Commanders knew that holding the line indefinitely was impossible. Something dramatic would be required to change the course of the war. Behind the scenes, a bold and risky plan was taking shape, one that would either save South Korea or end the war in catastrophic failure. The fight for survival was not over. It was about to change completely. What happened next was one of the most dramatic reversals in modern military history, and it nearly ended the war as quickly as it had begun. While United Nations forces were locked in a desperate fight around the Busan perimeter, General Douglas MacArthur was planning something few believed was possible. He proposed an amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon, near Seoul. The risks were extreme, the tides were unpredictable, the harbor was narrow, the surrounding terrain was unforgiving. If the landing failed, thousands of troops could be trapped and destroyed. Many military planners opposed the idea. Incheon was considered unsuitable for a major landing, but MacArthur believed that the very reasons it seemed impossible were what would make it work. North Korean forces did not expect an attack there. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Their focus was fixed on crushing the Busan perimeter. On September 15th, 1950, United Nations forces launched the Incheon landing. Naval bombardment thundered across the coastline. Marines stormed the beaches under fire. Against expectations, the operation succeeded. Within hours, troops secured key positions. Within days, the port was fully in UN hands. The impact was immediate and devastating for North Korean forces. Their supply lines were severed. Communications collapsed. Units advancing in the south suddenly found themselves cut off and surrounded. At the same time, UN forces broke out of the Busan perimeter, pushing north in a coordinated counteroffensive. Seoul was retaken after fierce street fighting. The psychological effect was enormous. What had looked like certain defeat only weeks earlier was now a sweeping reversal. North Korean units retreated in disarray, thousands were captured, others fled north in panic, and at this moment, the war could have ended. North Korean forces were broken. The original goal of defending South Korea had been achieved, but a critical decision still remained. Rather than stopping at the 38th parallel, United Nations forces continued north. The mission shifted from defense to reunification. The aim was now to eliminate the North Korean government entirely and unify Korea under a single authority. As UN troops advanced deeper into the north, they approached the Yalu River, the border with China. Warnings began to surface. Intelligence reports suggested Chinese forces were massing across the border. Diplomatic messages hinted that China would not tolerate a hostile army on its frontier. These warnings were dismissed or underestimated. Commanders believed China would not risk direct confrontation with the United States and its allies. By October 1950, UN forces were stretched thin across rugged terrain. Supply lines lengthened. Winter approached. Confidence remained high, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Then, without warning, Chinese forces entered the war. They did not announce their arrival with massed armor or air power. Instead, they struck silently, moving at night through mountains and valleys. Entire UN units were suddenly surrounded. Communication broke down. Temperatures plunged. The war shifted again, this time with terrifying speed. What had begun as a bold push toward victory now turned into a fight for survival in one of the harshest environments imaginable. The consequences of pushing north would define the rest of the war. The tide had turned once before. It was about to turn again, but this time the cost would be far higher. The moment Chinese forces entered the war, the conflict changed completely. What had been a fast-moving campaign of advances and retreats became a brutal struggle for survival, fought in mountains, forests, and frozen valleys where nature itself became an enemy. Chinese troops crossed into North Korea in massive numbers, but they did so quietly. They moved at night, avoided roads, and concealed themselves in the terrain. Many carried little more than rifles and grenades, but they were disciplined, organized, and willing to endure extreme hardship. United Nations forces, stretched thin and confident after recent victories, were unprepared for the scale of what was coming. The first major Chinese attack struck in late October 1950. Units were hit suddenly, often from multiple directions. Entire formations found themselves surrounded. What made these assaults so effective was surprise. Chinese forces did not rely on overwhelming firepower. They relied on speed, numbers, and shock. As November arrived, temperatures began to plummet. Winter came early and hard to the Korean peninsula. In some areas, temperatures dropped far below zero. Weapons froze, vehicles stalled, wounded soldiers froze to death before they could be evacuated. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. One of the most harrowing episodes of the war unfolded at the Chosin Reservoir. United Nations forces, including U.S. Marines and Army units, were encircled by vastly larger Chinese formations. Supply lines were cut, ammunition ran low, the terrain offered little shelter, every movement was contested. Rather than collapsing, these units fought their way out. In brutal day-by-day fighting, they held together under relentless pressure, moving wounded and equipment through narrow mountain roads while under constant attack. The retreat from Chosin was not a defeat in the traditional sense, but it came at an enormous cost. Thousands were killed or wounded. Many more suffered permanent injuries from the cold. The battle became a symbol of endurance under impossible conditions. Across the peninsula, United Nations forces began a general withdrawal. Cities that had been liberated weeks earlier were abandoned once again. Seoul fell for the second time in January 1951. Civilians fled south in another wave of displacement, reliving the terror they thought had passed. By early 1951, the war had swung back toward the south, but it did not continue endlessly. United Nations commanders stabilized the front roughly near the original dividing line. Counteroffensives regained lost ground. The Chinese advance slowed as their supply lines stretched and casualties mounted. At this point, the reality of the war became unavoidable. Neither side could achieve total victory without catastrophic escalation. The idea of unifying Korea by force faded. What remained was a grinding, deadly stalemate. Political tensions reached a breaking point. Disagreements over strategy, including calls to expand the war into China, created deep divisions among leadership. General Douglas MacArthur was eventually removed from command, a decision that shocked the American public but underscored how dangerous the situation had become. By mid-1951, the front lines hardened. The war settled into trench fighting, artillery duels, and limited offensives that gained little ground at immense cost. Soldiers fought and died for hills and ridgelines that would change hands repeatedly. The battlefield froze in place, but the violence did not stop. The Korean War had entered its longest and most exhausting phase. It was no longer a war of sweeping movements or dramatic breakthroughs. It was now a war of attrition, endurance, and waiting. And while the fighting dragged on, a question loomed over every battlefield and negotiating table. How does a war end when neither side can win and neither side is willing to stop? By the summer of 1951, the Korean War had reached a grim equilibrium. The front lines now ran close to where the war had begun, near the 38th parallel, but the cost to reach this point was staggering. Millions were dead or displaced, entire cities lay in ruins. Yet the fighting did not stop. Instead, the war entered a long, grinding phase defined by attrition. Both sides dug in. Hills, ridgelines, and fortified positions became the focus of repeated assaults. Trench systems snaked across mountainsides. Artillery thundered day and night. Small advances were measured in yards and paid for in blood. Some hills changed hands multiple times, their names becoming synonymous with relentless violence. For the soldiers on the ground, the war became one of endurance rather than movement. Life was spent under constant shell fire, extreme weather, and exhaustion. Morale suffered as it became clear that victory, in the traditional sense, was no longer possible. Many were fighting simply to survive the next day. At the same time, negotiations began. Talks opened in mid-1951, but progress was painfully slow. The most contentious issue was the fate of prisoners of war. Thousands of captured soldiers did not want to be returned to their home countries. Fearing punishment or execution, neither side was willing to compromise easily. And while diplomats argued, soldiers continued to die on the front lines. Air power intensified during this period. Bombing campaigns devastated infrastructure across North Korea, targeting factories, rail lines, dams, and supply centers. Entire towns were flattened. Civilians bore much of the suffering, caught in a war they had no power to stop. The conflict dragged on for 2 more years. Casualties continued to mount for minimal territorial change. Public support for the war waned in the United States and elsewhere. Political pressure increased on all sides to bring the fighting to an end. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The guns fell silent, but the war did not truly end. The armistice was not a peace treaty, it was a ceasefire, an agreement to stop fighting, not a resolution of the conflict. No formal peace was ever declared. Technically, North and South Korea remain at war to this day. The agreement established the demilitarized zone, a heavily fortified buffer stretching across the peninsula. Families were permanently separated. Entire generations grew up without seeing relatives on the other side of the line. The border became one of the most heavily guarded places on Earth. The consequences of the Korean War reached far beyond Korea itself. It set the pattern for Cold War conflicts around the world. It cemented the division of the peninsula into two radically different societies. It reshaped military doctrine, foreign policy, and global alliances. South Korea would eventually rebuild and transform into a major economic power. North Korea would become one of the most isolated states in the world. Both paths were shaped by the war that never officially ended. By the time the fighting slowed and negotiations dragged on, the true cost of the Korean War became impossible to ignore. Estimates vary, but historians agree that between 2.5 and 4 million people lost their lives during the conflict. This total includes soldiers and civilians alike, making the Korean War one of the deadliest wars of the Cold War era. South Korea suffered approximately 137,000 military deaths, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. North Korea's losses were even higher, with estimates ranging from 215,000 to over 400,000 soldiers killed. Chinese forces, who entered the war late but in massive numbers, suffered somewhere between 180,000 and more than 400,000 deaths, with hundreds of thousands wounded. The United States lost roughly 36,500 soldiers killed and more than 100,000 wounded. Other United Nations forces collectively lost several thousand more. But the largest share of the dead were civilians. Between 2 and 3 million Korean civilians are believed to have been killed during the war. Many died in bombings that flattened cities and villages. Others were executed during political purges, accused of collaborating with the enemy by whichever side happened to control the area at the time. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or left homeless. Families were torn apart. often permanently, as the front lines shifted again and again. Entire communities vanished. Infrastructure was destroyed on a massive scale. By the time the armistice was signed, much of the peninsula lay in ruins, and a generation had grown up knowing nothing but war. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but its legacy is anything but forgotten. It still defines borders, politics, and lives more than 70 years later. A war that began with a line drawn on a map ended without an ending at all. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.